Hello, my name is Robert Schmid, also known as Mr. IoT. Good morning, good afternoon. I am Deloitte's Chief IoT Technologist with a deep passion for all things digital. This week on Coffee with Mr. IoT, I'm talking with Chris Bates, a senior manager in our government practice. And I just thought we'll talk today about the Internet of Things, the government. I don't know, maybe we even get to hear from Chris about the wall. So welcome, Chris. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Robert. Really appreciate allowing me to be on your show.
So I didn't ask you about this whole title thing to talk about the wall and what role IoT has. Were you shocked when you saw me picking up that topic?
I was, in fact, when I salet it come through last night, I went, uh-oh, he's going into the wall. Got to do a little bit of background research on this. Need to get ready for it.
So let's just back up a little bit before we get into that meaty topic. You are part of our government practice. What does that mean? How does that work? Just give a little bit of a background, and tell us about your work, or as much as you can.
Sure. In the federal practice, traditionally, we've been in support of the U.S. federal government. So our clients are across all the government agencies at the cabinet level and most of the next 2 layers down. We have clients in all aspects of government. My support has been traditionally in the technology realm, systems engineering, and IoT being a great systems engineering play. So a systems engineer being someone we see as who's very successful, potentially very successful at running IoT type projects.
So, it's an interesting thing, right? I'm Austrian. I've been in this country 20 years. So for me, this whole sort of split between city, state, and government has become more natural. But and for people who have lived here their entire life, that's sort of like always been the case. But I think it's something that's somewhat unique to a country like the US to have such a strong split between state and federal. You want to talk a little bit about this and how that manifests in work for you?
Sure. Our traditional alignment has been to do that split between the US government and then those state and local governments. And a lot of it's around the regulations involved with contracting with those entities. When you deal with the US government, there's one set of federal acquisition regulations. That's one rule book to follow. But when you start dealing with the states, you now have 50 different rule books. And you get to the municipalities, it's even more. So we did some division of to be able to support that. We're seeing now, though, that the problems and the issues that our clients have are similar. And it's making a lot of sense to have some convergence around those. Yes, we still need the specialty to understand those different rules, but the convergence on the same client issues is bringing us closer together into a government practice.
So I know there's CIOs for cities, there's CIOs for states, there's CIOs for government agencies. How long have we had this sort of thing that there are CIOs? I think it's a fairly new thing, if I'm right. And how do they work together across?
Well, we've seen the trend from government agencies switch to more and more business-like. They're organizations that need to manage very similar aspects that we see in business organizations. And we're even seeing that translate to the military, that much of a business-like type environment. So it made sense to put a C-suite in place for these organizations so that they can execute efficiently as government agencies and good stewards of our tax dollars to execute on their mission.
One of my friends is a former Colorado CIO, Kristen Russell. I'm actually trying to get her on the show at one point in time, so we'll hear from her too. So let's get back to the technology stuff. And, looking at your LinkedIn, you have a really interesting background because you actually worked for the government, right?
Yes, I did.
What did you do? Tell us about it.
Well, I was in the Marine Corps for 9 years, and my time in the Marine Corps was very exciting. I actually flew in F-18 Hornets. So fun, exciting career there. My last tour was in flight test in Hornets. Talk about lighting your hair on fire, going upside down, breaking the speed of sound every chance we could just because we could. Very, very enjoyable time of my career.
Which seat did you sit in, the front or the back?
I sat in the back, so I was a professional backseat driver. And I have a lot of fun with that. I got to tell pilots where to go in more ways than one. So very enjoyable.
Did your wife still let you sit in the passenger seat, or do you want to sit in
the back? No. She's my backseat driver now.
So I find this interesting, right? And I want to hear from you about this, and this is why I think this is super interesting, and then we'll get a little bit back to today. But the last couple of years, 5 years, this Internet of Things has been sort of a hip term. I always say that soon we're going to call it the Internet again. There was never the Internet of people, really. It's just the Internet. I don't know why we make a big deal out of this. But really, for you, this must be even more weird because, this is like, I think, 10, 15 years ago that you were flying Hornets, right?
My last time in Hornet was 11 years ago, yes. And for that 9 years before, I was flying in Hornets.
But they were all connected, right?
Yes, we did the Internet of Things. That's what's amazing about this is that back then, our aircraft communicated. Yes, we had voice communication, but we also had digital communication. So we were sharing information across multiple platforms, whether they were in the air, on the ground, on the sea. That was digital transfer of information. Our airplanes and all those other units were sensors collecting data in varying formats, doing some synthesis of that data, and then providing it for the users in an actionable format so that we could make warfighting decisions rather than business decisions.
So how does this knowledge from back then benefit you today? One. And my second question for you is, I look at this and say 11 years ago, they had something the business talks about today. What's going on in some of the stuff today that we're going to talk about in 3 years?
3 years. So back then, we were collecting data and putting it in a format that, like I said, allowed us to make warfighting decisions. But the big struggle was you had the OEMs. So the big manufacturers of these warfighting systems made everything proprietary. And it took the US government to get involved, to set standards so those disparate vehicles could communicate with each other. So we had communications protocol, digital communication protocols that allowed us to interact. There's an opportunity where the US government stepped in, defined some standards, and that were beneficial to everybody. It was counterintuitive to those manufacturers to go down that path. They wanted to keep it somewhat siloed because then they could keep the business. But when the government forced them to open up, that allowed more cross-collaboration for the end user. We're starting to see that in IoT, in the commercial practice. When I went to the CES earlier this year, you were there as well, the biggest barrier to entry we saw was into the smart home was the ecosystem. If you buy into one ecosystem, you're stuck. The sensors don't talk to each other if they're outside that ecosystem. So you have to pick the right one that meets your needs. But if you find a sensor that's better over here that you really like, you're stuck if you're not in that ecosystem. And I'm starting to see some convergence. I'm starting to see people play well together. Certain companies are opening up their APIs, they're allowing access into their ecosystem. I think it's better for everybody when they do that.
So I understand how when you flew the Hornets, right, and when you were the customers of those OEMs, how it was easy for your vendors to apply and kind of enforce standards. The government was the customer of those vendors. Those vendors were sort of your OEMs. So you said, hey, we need those standards. Do you think the government has a role today also to foster, promote, maybe even enforce standards? And I don't know, I've used three different terms very selectively because I know they're all different. So I'm kind of curious what you think about standards and what role the government plays in that.
Well, I think the interesting part here is not necessarily in the interoperability of different systems and different sensors and networks. I think there's some value in some standardization. We see it with HTTP, with the IP protocols. So there's value in that. But I think the vendors can start to drive that, and you can start to see ecosystems, maybe one emerge over another. I'm okay there. Where I think the government has a strong role is in privacy. And I think the EU has taken a great stance on that. When the EU stepped out and said, look, we don't know, the individual consumer doesn't know the extent of the data that's being shared about them without their knowledge. It's an automatic setting when you get any device that it's automatically set up to share. And there's some value in sharing that, but that automatic setting versus the opt-in type environment, I believe is where the EU is going to say, let's make the consumer more informed about the data that's being shared about them so they can opt into it and realize the benefits from it, rather than being scared like we're seeing in the US, where folks are saying, hey, Big Brother's watching, they're collecting everything. Well, maybe if there's more transparency about that, then people can start to be more smart about what they purchase and how they interact in the Internet of Things.
So I have to ask you, and you might not be able to tell me, but have you worked with the NSA personally in your history, in your career?
If I did, I wouldn't be able to tell you that.
Yeah, I want you to live after this. So yes, just don't say anything you shouldn't say. I was just curious.
Sure.
Okay, so hey, just in case you're just joining, you're watching Coffee with Mr. IoT. My name is Robert Schmid, Deloitte's Chief IoT Technologist, and today my guest is Chris Bates, a Senior Manager in our government practice. So we're having some really fun talking about a variety of different topics, from hornets to not being able to say if you worked in the NSA. What are you working in right now? And tell us a little bit. I know you really talk a lot about IoT in government. I'm curious, what are you working on today?
One thing that we had this theory that the government would benefit from IoT. We saw government agencies not even planning for it, and that a lot of them were seeing the shiny object flashing around called IoT, and the more innovative ones were saying, hey, we know we should be doing something with it, but we don't know what to do with it. We put in our strategic plan, most didn't have it there. But what we're actually doing is looking at use cases where IoT would benefit the government. In places like fleet telematics, smart buildings, asset management, we're seeing organizations in governments that would benefit from those IoT use cases. And where we see that value, we're going to those clients and we're running proof of concepts. So we're bringing that IoT technology, we're bringing the right people together with the clients that would benefit from it and proving the value, helping substantiate the business case to taking IoT to scale.
You have a use case you can tell us about? I know we talk a lot about smart city use cases, and they go from parking to smart buildings to a variety of different things. I'm curious, can you tell us a use case in particular that you find interesting or that's being really worked on or something like that?
Sure, maybe I'll give you two. How about this? Two. In the smart buildings realm, there's a lot to be done. And the workforce of today is demanding that smarter building. So as you walk into most Deloitte spaces, we've got some of the creature comforts that you would expect from IT in those spaces now. You walk into a building and it knows where you're at. Your smartphone says, hey, Chris, welcome to Deloitte Roslyn. And would you like to hotel? Would you like a seat? We recommend that on this floor, this seat, would you like to check in now? So some of those conveniences are expected from today's workforce. And we're not seeing that in the government yet. And the government is trying to attract and retain that from that same high-tech talent pool that's expecting that type of convenience and efficiency. So a great use case for us is helping government agencies get to that place where they can attract and retain the top talent that has that expectation. Very, very interesting and fruitful for us. But a corollary, and maybe we can just touch that and dive deeper if we need to in any of them, is government agencies with fleets of vehicles. So if you start to think of scale when it comes to vehicles, there are a lot of aspects around that where you can gain efficiencies. The cost cutting necessary in government, it's still there. And you look at where is the biggest cost for these government agencies, it tends to be in operations. So if you can gain some efficiencies in operations, then you're helping your bottom line and you're becoming able to turn that back around and provide more in mission support for your agency. In fleets of vehicles, especially where there are large fleets of vehicles, if you can gain fuel efficiencies, if you can gain safety improvements, so you don't have people missing work or have dollar figures associated with injuries or lost equipment, there's some benefits to be gained from that. So that we call it fleet telematics. It's a very interesting application of IoT for us.
And the government has a lot of government vehicles that drive around, right? So there's a lot of they own or even lease some of the equipment, and so there's a real huge opportunity there, money-wise too, right?
Yes, the vehicles and the buildings. What does every government agency have? Vehicles and buildings, right? It's there across almost every agency. So if you can apply IoT to those, you can start to allow that agency to realize the benefits from IoT.
So the government must have this. I know every corporation has this. You have an old building, it's not really sensor enabled. You know, it's sort of brownfield, right? It's not greenfield. You don't start from scratch. You just have something existing. What's the ROI on something like this? How long does it take for the investment to pay back on a building, on a fleet? Are we talking 6 months? Are we talking 5 years? What do you see?
It varies because there's some numbers that are out there on where people are attacking. And the cost we're seeing in real estate, it's interesting. It's actually tenfold change on each of these. When you start to look at the energy efficiency savings, energy efficiency, the cost of energy in a building is somewhere around $3 per square foot, something like that. So if you're looking to get energy efficiencies, you're attacking a $3 per square foot number. And you can do that, and you can gain some good benefits from that. And in fact, that's where we're seeing governments attack first. They're saying, well, if I can control the thermostat, nobody's in the building in the evening. Or if I can control the power consumption because I can turn the lights off automatically when nobody's in a room. They're seeing benefits from that very quickly. Smart metering of their buildings to understand first their energy consumption, and then two, to be able to control it when it's in low demand. Don't leave your lights on. Don't leave your computer running overnight. Simple things like that. They're seeing quick return on those investments.
What's quick? I'm thinking government and corporations might have different points of view. Quick. I'm a really impatient person, so what's quick?
When you deal with the government, their budget cycles are annually. So what they're looking for is that they're doing quarterly reporting on their financials in 6 months and 1 year. So for them, there's a contracting effort that takes some time. Maybe that first 3 months, you get the deployment that takes a period of time, and then you start to realize those benefits after the deployment's out there. So a 12-month cycle is not unheard of. In fact, that's fairly fast when you start dealing with the government.
You know, it's actually great, right? I mean, even for government, even for a regular commercial place, I remember we were doing big system implementations and they take 24 months. Now, when we talk about the Internet of Things, people don't want to hear years anymore. They want to hear months or weeks, right? So it's pretty impressive. I am actually thinking that, you know, this is one of the big secrets I find of IoT, that it actually does return value very, very quickly. And let me switch back to the original topic that I had on the thing, and let's just talk about the wall. And, you know, let's just, look, I could talk about this topic a long time. I have all my opinions, and I'm sure you have yours about this. But let's just look at this from the point of view, what can IoT do around border protection, about immigration? And so maybe you can split it into what's already happening and what do you see coming and where can we go with that? What's there with Internet of Things and technology that can happen there away from a physical wall, more like on the technology side. Be curious what you think and what you see.
Sure. When you think about protecting the border, you have to understand the immensity of the problem. 1,900 miles for one border. That's huge. And to think that we could build a 50-foot tall cement wall that goes 1,900 miles, that is a horribly daunting task. But my opinion is, let's look at some efficiency.
No comment.
My opinion is, let's look at some efficiencies, right? Are there places where we can gain efficiencies? And there are technologies that are out there, sensors, which is the heart of IoT, that enable us to cover a broad, much broader area a lot easier, a lot cheaper, and quite possibly even better. When you look at whether it's radars or motion detectors or multispectral cameras, those are all looking for any sort of illegal type crossing above the surface. A big challenge we're seeing is, how do you detect below the surface? We do have ground penetrating radar, but it can only go so deep. And we're finding—
How deep does it go?
Well, it's actually useful. at discovering things that are fairly close to the surface. I mean, you're talking graves, not tunnels that are 80 feet below. So when you deal with a tunnel that's 80 feet below the surface, it becomes real challenging to detect that from above. You have to look at other methods for detecting that and being able to close it off. So sensors are advancing, as you know. The technology, the ubiquitous nature of sensors now, and even the price point, such that we can get the ability to provide coverage over a large area in a much more technologically advanced and cost-effective manner than we ever have before. That's being looked at now. And in fact, we're even looking at the ability to make that mobile. It might not need to be in the same place every time. And there might be places that don't need coverage at all, based on what the terrain looks like. So it's amazing the advances that we can get with the technology and the advances in sensor technology that enable that same mission of knowing who is coming and what is coming and being able to control that access.
It feels to me that this is a huge opportunity. I need to stop using that word, but it's a big opportunity for the government actually to lead the way. And we talked about the Hornets that were connected and talked to each other and had actual standards that then were pushed down to OEMs, which is something I'm sure many users of today's platforms in the industrial space would love more. I can see something similar here in terms of physical safety, safety in cities, safety on your own property that can actually be enabled with sensors like this. And I can see the government playing a leading role in this space, right? Through the technologies that get developed there. Funny to me, I fly drones in my spare time. And I've had this for the longest time where I thought this is just a toy. And now when I listen to you, right? I mean, why mount these things when you have a drone that can fly fast, has a camera on there, transmits the video in real time, miles away, and then people can look at that video, not just control the drone, but actually look at the video and then analyze it and then make actions on that, such as alerting people. That's pretty fascinating. Do you think that's what we're going to see, the government taking a leading role in this?
Well, personally, I've been looking at drone video surveillance for over a decade. That capability has been out there, right? And
I'm going to call you Mr. Hornet going forward, by the way. Is that okay?
Mr. Hornet, okay. Just yesterday, with all the rain and everything, we had a leak in our roof, and the roofer came out with a drone to go inspect my roof to find out what was wrong with it before he actually did the repair. So I thought that was interesting. Yes, we are protecting our borders with drones. I mean, they're out there. We're protecting manned aviation and remotely piloted aviation assets. So that's a great news story. When you're dealing with 1,900 miles of it, it takes a lot of drones and a lot of manned and unmanned assets, right? So there is a right mix that's out there. It's not just one technology. It's the right mix for the right environment that would allow us to secure that border. And you bring up a great point about, well, should the government take a leading role in this? Well, earlier attempts to use sensors to secure the border failed due to integration problems. When you have that sensor suite, you have to integrate the data. You've got one sensor collector or one sensor that's collecting data and feeding it back into a common point. Well, if that common point can't read the data and present it in an actionable format, then it's useless. You shouldn't even have that sensor out there. And they struggle greatly with that. This more recent approach with more open standards has enabled better interoperability.
Chris, I could go on for another 25 minutes, but we've sort of come to the end of Coffee Chat with Mr. IoT. Any closing comments before we close today?
Well, I'm excited for where IoT is going as an industry. And I'm encouraged to see that governments are turning to IoT to help them better perform their mission. And I'm excited personally to be a part of that, to help government agencies be able to realize the benefits from IoT. And appreciate your time and for allowing me to be here.
Chris, it was a real pleasure to have you. Our coffee break is coming to a close. Thanks so much for a great conversation. I don't know, this is always the highlight of my week. I learned something, I enjoy meeting people, and it was a real pleasure. Please join us again next Friday. Oh, no, actually, next Friday I'm off. I'm on PTO in the Sequoias, so no connectivity. But the week after, for another coffee with Mr. IoT. And if you missed any of today's conversation or past shows, please come to my YouTube channel. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye. Have a good weekend.
Thanks.